lovely. And what I do with all that education is that I work as a private practice dietitian. So I have a practice in Manuka, and I mostly work with clients one-on-one. So people will come in and have different aspects of their health that they're trying to address. Today, we're sort of addressing, a whole heap of those with you. Some may apply, some you may already have knowledge on, but today we're sort of building on that knowledge and hopefully, sort of answer some of the questions you might have that, you weren't really quite sure about. So in today's presentation, we'll cover some of the common symptoms that occur in Parkinson's disease and how they actually impact nutrition, and hopefully give you some tools that will help you manage hydration, fibre, and your gastrointestinal function. So when I say gastrointestinal function, we're talking about your gut and how it's working and how well it's working and what we can do to really get it going optimally. We'll also discuss unintentional weight loss, managing your medication and potentially side effects such as nausea. And this, you'll find everybody comes with a different set of symptoms, and they're dealing with different impacts. So we're trying to look through those. The majority of what I'd like to look at as well is what the current research is doing, the gut health, and looking at that neuroprotective diet. I'm really aware that I don't want you to become overwhelmed with exactly, eating the, ins and outs. Sort of, I heard the conversation earlier today, just as you guys were jumping on, and we need to make sure that diet isn't overwhelming. What we need to make sure is it's something that's realistic and something that you can implement and walk away with today, just with those little changes that you can start to sort of do to really make a difference. So when we look at the research, the most current sort of stuff is talking about what they term the MIND diet, but also the ketogenic diet, and what the research is sort of doing, what results are coming out of that, and how we could implement that if in fact it was something that's suitable for you. And as I said, we'll save all of those questions to the end. So some of the common symptoms that you'll experience with, it's individual for everybody, but there's a list of there, and the percentage of people that over the course, that they will experience early Parkinson's, you'll have probably less symptoms, but they can develop and change over time. So, I mean, many of you are already aware you're living through your own set of symptoms, and what's sort of more applicable to you. So when the ones here that I want to focus on are really, the ones that impact your diet and nutrition. And some of the non-motor symptoms can be associated with nutrition management. So these are what we sometimes call the invisible symptoms. So talking about constipation, loss of smell, fatigue, some urinary issues, weight changes. You could be experiencing weight loss because of changed energy requirements. And some therapies such as deep brain stimulation, they can create better control over dyskinesia, but they actually can lead to weight gain because you have a decreased energy expenditure and sometimes changes to eating habits. So, I mean, why do we care as well about nutrition, and, what does it actually matter? But we're really trying to avoid or reduce the risk of malnutrition. If you're in that state of malnutrition, you'd be likely to lose weight, lose muscle mass, and once you start to lose muscle mass strength, you're losing sort of independence, potentially also increased risk of falls, which is what we're trying to avoid. Some of those common symptoms that we talk about, revolving around nutrition is really those gastrointestinal or the GI issues, so the constipation and gastroparesis. So the gastroparesis is a slow stomach emptying, and I'll go through that a little bit further as we go. So fatigue and loss of energy, and what we can do there is really look at what your meal timing is like, times where it's better to be preparing meals, having it sort of stored away or bulk cooking and things like that. Smell loss can actually affect food intake, because the tastes really rely on our smell. And if food is no longer appealing to you because you've lost that, that can really affect how often, you might be eating. Swallowing problems, this will actually be covered in more detail in next week's session. We've got a speech pathologist coming on board to sort of help you look, maybe, if swallowing is an issue for you and whether an assessment is necessary, or if it's already established, how are you managing with diet? And of course, we've got decreased appetite. Okay, so we'll start with constipation. And basically why this happens. So constipation can have a real impact on quality of life. So stool habits rely on the fact that your gut muscles need to be operating and called peristalsis, which is sort of like this, it's a long muscle, as you can sort of see here on the diagram. You've got the internal intestinal lining, and then it's surrounded by several layers, but a muscle layer which helps the contraction and movement of stools through the bowel. So nerve degeneration can affect the bowel, so it can cause slowness or rigidity, and stools are able to move less effectively through the bowel. Medications, specifically with Parkinson's, can affect constipation, but we're also looking at, what is the quality of diet? If you've had changes to your ability to do physical activity, that will also affect how effective the bowel is. So we're worried about the absorption of nutrients. So as you can see from the diagram, we've got this sort of curly sort of inside, and that's because the intestine is covered in like these finger-like sort of projections, which increase the surface area of the intestines, so that that's where you absorb all your nutrients for food, from food. So if you've got constipation and things are sort of backed up a little bit there, you're less able to absorb nutrients. But then also levodopa, which, as many of you would know, the common medication in Parkinson's relies on the gut operating well to also be absorbed in this same area. So if it's not as if it's sort of backed up a bit and all this surface area are affected, then the effectiveness of your medication is going to be impacted as well. So an over full bowel can put also pressure back on the bladder. And because we know that, there can be some urinary symptoms as well, that's going to affect the pressure or how much your bladder can hold. Straining on the toilet to pass a stool can weaken your pelvic floor and also lead to longer term bowel incontinence. So I actually have done a fair bit of work. A lot of my clients will go off and see a physiotherapist specialising in pelvic floor and really looking at ways that you can sort of help avoid that real sort of straining and things like that, positioning, breathing, it sounds silly, but it can actually be really helpful. And so when we look at managing constipation, the same sort of treatment applies as for the general population. So the focus, the number one focus needs to be firstly on fluid. I'll go on to fibre, but certainly fluid as a first. So we should be aiming for about 1.5 to 2 litres a day, which, I mean, for some, they look at that number and think that's, that can be quite, oh, there we go, someone's having a drink now. So you might find that thirst response is really not as strong as it used to be. So you have to rely on other things. So you might want to set reminders, use visual cues, set yourself up a little sign in the kitchen or somewhere that you regularly go to have a glass of water. You might fill up a jug or a water bottle early in the day and really aim to get through that by the end of the day. You could be infusing your water with, slices of lemon, lime, mint leaves. You could also be using herbal teas to really get up your fluid intake. Of course, you can also, the fluid content of meals will also contribute to this, but it certainly has to be the first place to start. If we go straight into fibre and really increasing the fibre in your diet, it actually can impact constipation. So it can make constipation worse if you don't have enough fluid already in the diet. Because what fibre does is actually, it remains pretty much undigested until it gets to your gut. And then when it's at the gut, it attracts water to really bulk up your stools. There's actually multiple types of fibre, but soluble fibre is what is really good to focus on. So when you're looking at, say, your breads or cereals, biscuits, there is actually a fibre label, a fibre column there that you can have a look at. And generally, if you've looked at ingredients, nutrition tables before, you'll see that there'll be two columns. One is per serve and the other one is per 100 grams. And if you go down to fibre, you'd actually want to be choosing products that are about 6 grams of fibre per 100 grams. And it lets you compare products. So, you know, it's something to just be in the back of your mind when you're choosing different foods. So we know, as I said before, exercise can really help improve bowel function, and you can actually do your own intestinal massage. So when you're doing this, you're actually using, it's not hard, and you're using the palm of your hand, and what you're actually doing is working in the direction of your large intestine. So you'd be coming up on the right hand side, just under your diaphragm, and then down on the left hand side. And just that gentle sort of movement can be, you know, helpful in sort of really stimulating the bowel. For many of you, stool softeners or laxatives would actually be necessary, and talking to your GP about potentially the best one for you. Commonly, I see things like Benefiber, gosh, if I've just had a mental blank, Benefiber, but also something like Movicol could be used as well. For those who have problems with fermentation, there are some non-fermentable fibre supplements that might be added. Now, when we talk about food, you know, it's really, you know, thinking about all those grains and cereals and things like that, which can be harder. One of you mentioned that you're celiac as well. So then, you know, this needs to be a consideration as well. But generally, you know, grainy or rye breads, looking at your high fibre cereals, oats, brown rice, barley, psyllium is a great thing that you can add to sort of smoothies and things like that. And your old-fashioned, you know, your prunes, I shouldn't say old-fashioned, but they've, I think, been a long-term stable, but, you know, prunes, pears, kiwi fruit are amazing for constipation because of their ability to really draw water into the bowel. Your citrus fruits, and then your chickpeas, lentils, beans, things like that. Researchers also looked at higher fructan foods, and fructan is just a sugar type in fruits and veggies. So looking at your shallots, onions, leek, beetroot, Brussels sprouts, peaches, and things like that. Okay, so gastroparesis. So gastroparesis is actually where the contents of your stomach stays in the stomach longer than it should. So you might have symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, retching. You could have discomfort or bloating, or, you know, all of a sudden that you're not able to finish standard size meals, or you're feeling excessively full after meals. So they might be some signs that food is staying in your stomach longer than it used to. So we get triggers that tell our stomach to empty, and sometimes those messages are a little bit confused. So I think, you know, in terms of medication, it's the same as for constipation, that gastroparesis can delay the delivery, particularly of levodopa, into the small intestine where it needs to be absorbed. So if you've got food as well as medication staying in the stomach a little bit longer, you're going to increase those off times. So to get around this, they're, you know, speaking to your GP, because there are medications that can help with this, but you need to try and look at meals that have a higher fluid volume. So they're going to pass through the stomach faster than a sort of a big, heavy sort of meal that might be, higher in fat or higher in protein. So smaller, regular meals are better for this. And then chewing your foods really well, but also serving up foods that are easier to chew and swallow. So as I said, those high fat foods can impact how long food stays in the stomach, because basically your body has the ability to assess what's in your food. So if you have a higher fat meal, the stomach knows that it needs to stay there and churn a little bit longer before it's released. So we want to try and work the other way and let it pass through faster. Higher fibre foods, unfortunately, which this goes against what we're sort of recommending for constipation, that higher fibre foods can also do the same thing. So we need to spread that fibre out across the day. Carbonated drinks, so your fizzy drinks and things like that, and alcohol can also impact what's happening with the time in the stomach and the gastroparesis. Okay, so unintentional weight loss and nausea. So there are many things which can impact what you eat, how you eat, the types of foods you eat, how you enjoy food, and they're all sort of listed up here. So, and whilst they don't occur for everybody, there are a consideration for some. So with a tremor, you actually can, you have an increased energy burn. So you're using up more energy just with that muscle movement. So when you do that, it means that you need more energy to sort of in order to maintain weight, because you're burning through more each day. If upper limb tremors are present, it can impact the way you physically eat food. So it means it can take a little bit longer. You want to maintain your independence with food, but it can be hard. You might be looking at a higher energy or a higher protein diet in this case, and you may need to look at nutritional supplements that can be beneficial in meeting your increased requirements. So then bradykinesia, which is a slowness of the muscles, as well as fatigue, can impact greatly on eating. So it may mean that your portion sizes that you're able to eat really reduce. And obviously the less you're able to eat, weight loss can often result. Sometimes if it takes too long, you just have had enough and you give up well before you're finished because you can't be bothered to sort of go through it anymore. And sometimes, it's not uncommon to see people that may take up to 2 hours to finish a meal. So it's understandable that they want to walk away. Fatigue will actually impact on if you're cooking your own meals and have less reliance on support. So meal preparation can be a problem as well. So again, going back to that sort of more grazing approach. So smaller, more frequent meals, helping with, finger foods and things like that across the day, having that available to you throughout the day, rather than relying on a big impact. Dysphagia is something that we will talk about more next week, and that's where we're having issues with swallowing. And so we want to be careful that you know the signs of what to look out for, and when to seek help from a speech pathologist. Okay, so anosmia is another one, which is the loss of smell. And as I mentioned before, it means that your enjoyment of food can change a little bit. It'll affect your appetite and potentially then and weight loss. So we really want to optimize the smells and tastes of food. So using those fresh herbs and spices to try and appeal, you might sort of find, adding extra salt or extra sugar, that's what people tend to do because they're seeking additional flavour. But really, we know that that's not great on health. So we want to rely on those fresh herbs and spices instead. Of course, the fine motor changes, will affect your ability to prepare. Cutting up, chopping, whisking foods will also impact on your preparation. The hand-mouth action will be affected in this case as well, and tend to lead to less food intake. So thinking about those adapted cutlery and, for continue self-feeding. So with nausea, some medications used to treat Parkinson's may cause nausea, and this will impact on your ability to want to eat, and, of course, then increasing weight loss risk. So again, going back to those small, more regular meals, nausea can, start thinking about those, the old-fashioned sort of dry ginger ale or lemonade or things like that to help with nausea, but also dry salty crackers can also sort of help with that there. Okay, so then dyskinesia will also affect metabolism and how much energy you're burning through. And so you might need increased energy. You might be looking at fortifying foods as well as adding those nutritional sort of supplements or drinks in if you just can't get it through food alone. So I guess summarising all that and what we do in terms of food, aiming, like you've probably heard me say it over and over again already, but smaller portions more frequently. So you could be turning that into six meals or snacks across the day, bite-sized portions or finger foods that are easier to manage. It doesn't matter, those finger foods that are designed to be using your hands, that could be really helpful in the time it takes to eat. Make sure you sit upright and have good posture. So eating on a lounge or in bed where sort of this area is really sort of closed in, or there's more pressure on your stomach, really focus on where you're eating and concentrate on the task of eating. As we'll go into next week, you might need to modify foods and fluids if swallowing is an issue. Think about the temperature of your food. So if it's taking a long time to eat, you might want to reheat foods if they're getting cold, or use an insulated dish, a dish which sort of sits under your plate that tries to keep your foods sort of warm and palatable and still appealing. And then if you're using sort of utensils, just small amounts of food at a time, and use those assistive utensils if they're needed. So moving on to medication and how that affects food intake. So I think this is probably an area that's commonly talked about, talking about the timing of protein and levodopa if that's what you're using. And so you'll find that motor fluctuations actually develop over time, and you may become more intolerant, I guess, to medication, and then that will, changes to medications will be needed and discussed with your GP over time. When those changes can happen, you might have an increase in nausea, changes to your bowel, so there's constipation. You might have problems with blood pressure, which I'll talk to on in a minute, and changes to sort of behaviour, so confusion or impulsive or compulsive behaviour. As you would know already, there'd be periods of on and off times. So, on where the medication will be working well, and off where it's really, absorption hasn't happened, or, you're really not seeing the impacts of the medication. So try and utilise those on times. So, I know it's not always easy to choose when to have a bowel motion, but it can be good for that timing to sort of coincide. Or if you're sort of preparing your own meals, when you know you're feeling good, maybe use that to sort of cook ahead or sort of portion off some things to be either freeze or have in the fridge for times when you are sort of having that off time. Okay, so I wanted to talk for those, going back to the what we call postural or orthostatic hypertension, where your blood pressure is affected by medications. Again, going back to those smaller, more frequent meals, make sure you're drinking enough fluid and regularly. For some, it may be beneficial to sort of look at what their salt levels are doing, and you might be able to increase your salt a little bit, but be careful around doing that sort of independently. If you're suffering from urinary problems, look at reducing caffeine, especially later in the day, and then make sure you're getting the bulk of your fluid in before 5 o'clock, and after 5 o'clock, it's a little bit more cautionary. So with levodopa, when we eat protein, it's broken down into its base of amino acids. So these amino acids cross the intestinal wall, and then later on into the brain, they cross the blood-brain barrier. So levodopa actually uses this same amino acid carrier system in the intestines, and that's why there's often the recommendation that protein shouldn't be consumed with medication. So you have to be careful around this, because we have to make sure that you're meeting your protein requirements, because if you're not getting enough protein from your diet, you will start to eat away at your muscles and lose strength, and sort of, I guess that's your ticket to independence. So we have to be careful not to restrict protein, but think about more so the timing. So my recommendation is 30 minutes before a meal, so that your body is able to absorb it before you're adding food into it, or 2 hours after a meal. Your medication timing will be sorted out through your doctor and what you need, and then you monitor your food intake around that. For example, if you're having morning medication at 7, you'd have breakfast at 7:30, or then 2 hours afterwards, so that you're not impacting the sort of the transport system. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about what the research is doing in terms of Parkinson's development, but more importantly for you guys, Parkinson's progression. So when, I guess I'll step back a minute and then think about why, what's happening in Parkinson's when we think about the progression of the disease. So when metabolized, dopamine, which is sort of the main, this is all revolving around, it produces endogenous, which is internal toxins, such as free radicals. And these free radicals sort of go around in the brain, and they oxidize lipid membranes and cause cell death. It's a normal part of, what happens in our body every day. But the severe oxidative injury can lead to substantial loss of dopaminergic neurons. So these are neurons in the midbrain that actually produce dopamine, and that's what we see in Parkinson's disease. So a lot of the research on reducing the progression looks at reducing the free radicals that produce this oxidative damage in the brain. So the 3-part strategy should be adopted when we think about healthy diets in Parkinson's. So food choices should be A, neuroprotective, B, anti-inflammatory, and then antioxidant rich. So, this is what the science tells us, but what does this look like, on a day-to-day for you guys? So diets should be rich in whole real fruit foods to help address these strategies. So focus on fresh fruit, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, fish, poultry, olive oil, and fresh herbs and spices. There's a moderate amount of red meat in there. And then we're really trying to focus on minimizing those processed meats and snacks that are sort of, quite heavily processed, a lot of things added to them. They're going back to a natural sort of way of eating. And, often I talk to my clients about this, and it can seem quite daunting. You say, well, how do I overhaul my whole diet to look like that? But it's, as I said at the start, it's really a step-wise strategy. So we also know that, in research, there's a lot of benefits of omega-3 fatty acids. So these, it actually just keeps coming back to it in terms of, the research and many, many different sort of conditions in the body. Omega-3, is an amazing sort of substrate to have. So it acts as an energy substrate. It makes up a lot of our membrane components, and it helps maintain undisturbed neurology function. So, where does this come from? So a lot of your fatty fish, I'll go into it in the next slide, but your salmon, mackerel, sardines, tuna, you don't have to have them in the diet as often as you'd think. There was initial recommendations of at least 3 serves a week. That's sort of cut back a little bit more now. And there's actually differing evidence when we talk about supplemental omega-3 fatty acids. So there is actually some benefit to that. I'm not a fan of supplements in general. When we talk about the antioxidants, the new research is looking at that we're not getting this from supplements, we're getting it from food. So the idea would be that back to the omega-3s, it'd be about 1,000 milligrams a day if you were supplementing it. So we know also that anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects come from what we call phenolic compounds, and so they're naturally in food, in like a lot of our fruit and vegetables. All right, so another area of research which is really exciting, and I think, again, at the end here, I've said it's a watch this space because I really don't know enough about it at the moment. But the gut microbiome is constant. Like the research and our understanding of what the gut microbiome does for health is just amazing. And what they're starting to piece together now is really, really interesting. So we know that in Parkinson's, the gut microbiome is actually altered. And this change or this difference when looking at sort of controls or people that are unaffected by Parkinson's, we can see that there's a difference there. So it likely plays a role in its pathophysiology, and it affects our symptoms as well as your response to therapy, and the progression as well as the disease initiation. So gut dysbiosis, which just means that an imbalance, it's a potential therapeutic target. So looking at, can we alter what the gut microbiome is doing in Parkinson's to then look at what the outcomes for an individual might be. So currently, the alterations to the gut can be achieved through diet, which is great for me. This is my area of interest. So that's, of course, what's important to me. Looking at probiotics, prebiotics, and then potentially in the future, more fecal transplantation. But that's an area where they know that that good bacteria might exist in a certain fecal species, specimen, but trying to make it stick. So there's something that exists in all of our guts that means that certain bacteria survive and others don't. So whilst we could introduce these species, same as what a probiotic can do. So for those not sort of over what probiotics and prebiotics are, probiotics are bacteria that we can take. Generally, it comes in either a liquid or a tablet form, and it's the bacteria that reside in our gut. The prebiotic is basically food that we feed them. I like to think of them as pets for our gut. The bacteria act as pets, and the prebiotic acts as food. But basically, when we look at diet and how we can affect our gut through diet, it's through fibre. It's through fibre variety. So basically, you need to think of each different fruit or vegetable as a different source of fibre for those bacteria. So our aim is actually to get 30 different fibre varieties in a week. So that might be a different nut, a different cereal, a different grain. It could be a different fruit or a different vegetable sort of across the week. And when you start to nut out, you're not far off it, but it's about diet variety. But of course, this will be, developing, because we know that probiotics exist, say, at the pharmacy and things like that. But what the ones that are right for Parkinson's is unknown as yet, and that's something that we need to work on, and whether they're actually therapeutic and are able to stay around to give the benefit is the work that will need to continue. Okay, so the next diet I wanted to talk about was the ketogenic diet. I'll go through what the ketogenic diet is for those who are unsure. And then we'll look at what the research is actually pointing to. So it's long been researched, and it was initially designed back in the 1920s for seizures in children. So variations and adaptations of the diet have been seen sort of across the years, but generally it is a high fat, moderate protein and very low carbohydrate load in your diet. So what happens is that we use fat as an energy source as opposed to glucose. So glucose comes from carbohydrates, but the fat, when we're using fat as an energy source, we produce ketones instead. And ketones are able then to actually cross the blood-brain barrier, as does glucose, to sort of fuel the brain. Okay, so what we're sort of looking at, why is there this connection between the ketogenic and potential in Parkinson's disease? So there's actually only been 3 human trials that's looked at the ketogenic diet. So one in 2005, one in 2018, and then one in 2019. Now, I'm sorry, this next slide is for some of you, you might sort of just not be that interested, but for those of you who are, I thought I would just explain the research, because when people sort of want to try the ketogenic diet and see its effects on Parkinson's, they need to know what research has already been done and what are the limitations of that research. So lots of writing all over this, and this might be something that when we have printouts available of my slides. So if you're interested in that, we can reach out to Kate and she can send you that information over and you can have a closer look at it. But basically, I'll quickly go through. So in 2005, the study looked at 7 participants for a 4-week study. They had a breakdown of 90% of their diet was made up of fat, only 2% from carbohydrate and 8% from protein. When I look at, as a dietitian, when I look at these studies and the potential dangers of them, I have to look at, if someone was to implement this into their diet, what are the problems with it? So this 8% protein is actually inadequate amount of protein, especially when we're trying to maintain muscle mass. So the positives of it was that they saw, so only 5 actually were able to complete the study, 2 had to drop out. So they had improved symptoms, so including their resting tremor, freezing, gait, mood, and energy. They did lose an average of 6.1 kilos, which when I get to the end of this, I'll explain what are the limitations of a lot of these studies. So this study in particular, it had no control. So it means that it had no one on a standard diet to be able to compare to. It has the issue of a placebo potential. All of these studies, in fact, are short studies, and you'll see they're really small sample sizes. When we look at science, what we want to see is a massive study that has looked at thousands of people, not 7 or 50 or 14, to look at what's happening, to get some proper evidence behind using it. So something I want to talk about is the placebo effect is really profound, specifically in Parkinson's research, because a placebo effect, and a placebo is where you actually think that you're getting benefit, like you're mentally prepared that you are getting a benefit from this diet. It's really profound in Parkinson's because of the production of dopamine. And as you would know, any increase in dopamine is what we're actually trying to achieve to improve symptoms in Parkinson's. So it's very hard to tell, is it a placebo, dopamine, and it improved symptoms? And that's hard to tell. And if you had a control, then potentially you're having, a better look at that. So the study in 2008 did a little bit better. It doubled the length of the study. It had more participants at 47, but a bigger dropout rate, so only 38 finished it. They had a similar amount, they had a similar amount of calories and protein for each diet, meaning they're a bit more comparable. And they did have enough protein. So what we're aiming for is 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. And so this is getting more into the science, and some of you might really not, this is not appealing to you, but I will continue to talk through it. So they got small improvements. Both groups had small improvements in motor and non-motor symptoms, and a ketogenic had significantly better improvements in non-motor symptoms for urinary problems, pain, fatigue, and cognitive impairment. Participant lost an average of 4 to 5 kilos, but in this group, they remained overweight at the 8-week mark, probably because they started at a higher weight. Again, it was a short study, small sample size, and there were, in this diet in particular, with a big jump in the abrupt increase in fat intake, there were some problems with increased rigidity and tremor, and these resolved over, between 5 and 8 weeks throughout the study, but it meant that people dropped out of it because they weren't happy with sort of dealing with those side effects. Again, weight loss, and it also had just not enough fibre. And when we know that constipation is an issue in Parkinson's, this is of concern to me. So quickly, the last study, again, it had 14 participants, either in a low carbohydrate or a high carbohydrate group. The low carbohydrate had no benefit to motor function, but did have enhanced cognitive performance in executive daily ability and memory. Calorie intake did decline, potentially because it wasn't as appealing. And then weight loss was also seen. Again, small study sample, short duration. And there's you sort of got to question, are the effects due to a reduced body weight or increased performance of levodopa because of changes in protein? So basically, a summary of the ketogenic diet, it's really, really not for everybody. And it'll depend on what your symptoms are. All of those studies were short-term, small sample sizes. It is actually quite hard to follow and implement this diet long-term. You'll see some of the side effects listed there. They're initial and they will resolve after a few weeks. And we have to sort of address that all of these studies saw weight loss, which is not, if you're already at a weight that's compromised, then we don't want you losing any further weight. Diets were low in fibre, impacting your gastrointestinal symptoms. What else have we got? And it was hard for, to get the energy to exercise, and constipation is obviously an issue as well. What have we got there? Yeah, because of the high fat intake, your appetite is actually suppressed. And also you're going to have that delayed stomach emptying, which is an issue for those who already have gastroparesis. So putting this all together, for me, it's not something I would recommend. It needs longer study durations, larger sample sizes. The fact that it's hard to implement is not a positive for me. Okay, so over to the MIND diet. So this is really quite new in its connection with Parkinson's disease. It was initially developed for research in Alzheimer's, and MIND actually, many of you would probably heard about, they go on and on about the Mediterranean diet and how great that is for health. This is a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. So DASH was a diet that's, it stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, so high blood pressure. So it was in this new combination of these diets, so the Mediterranean DASH, intervention for neurodegenerative delay. So I'm glad they called it the MIND diet. It makes it a little bit easier to talk about. So the more recent research, in particular with Parkinson's, has really only taken place in the last couple of years. And basically a systematic review was produced in May this year. A systematic review is a type of study that looks at what studies have already existed. So I've listed there, it's a cohort study, 3 cross-sectional studies, and a randomized control trial. That's all mumbo jumbo, but basically they're different levels of research with differing structure to their research design. So a randomized control trial is actually like really good evidence. And so they showed that the MIND diet was positively associated with certain domains of cognition, as well as global cognitive function in older adults. So what about this diet that makes it quite effective? So we're looking at, as we went back to those 3 steps that we want in a diet for Parkinson's, it looks at the high dietary antioxidants. That was, for us, it's important about slowing the progression. So it promotes those omega-3 fatty acids, as well as vitamin E, which is sort of known both for with brain health. And more research, actually, I just, last night, just scrolling through the news, again, this idea of what we call flavonoids, which we get from food, and its association with being protective in the brain is really becoming to the forefront of research, as well as, general media are starting to pick up on that as well. So a study from the Harvard School of Public Health looked at flavonoids and what we call anthocyanin-rich foods, so blueberries and blackberries, and they showed that they were 40% less likely to develop Parkinson's disease when that is higher in the diet. Whilst I know we're not talking about, we're not trying to stop the development, because you guys are a group where it exists, and we're trying to focus on that progression. So diet high in whole plant foods, and so it's the phytochemicals like flavonoids. And you'll find these in things like grapes, tea, peaches, berries, tomato, broccoli, dark chocolate, apples, capsicum, parsley, and citrus fruits. So I'll give you a list that sort of might be more sort of implementable. But basically this diet is designed with 15 dietary components, 10 brain healthy foods, and then 5 foods that we sort of want to try and avoid. So this is all a bit over the place, but maybe if we can put together a table that I'll send over to Kate and she can distribute you these. So we're looking at what types of foods and how often do they occur in your diet each week or each day. So we've got your leafy green vegetables, and you're having 1 to 2 serves per day. So things like spinach, kale, lettuce, your collard greens, and then 1 to 2 serves per day of other vegetables. So, I've given you some examples there. And when I say a serve, you sort of think, well, is that 1 piece or, but a serve, you've got some equivalents there for you. So a serve of leafy greens is 1 cup because it's quite loosely packed, whereas other vegetables, half a cup is equivalent to 1 serve. The key to this diet is really about the berries, because it's highest in natural antioxidants. So we want 2 or more serves a week, any of the berries, and it doesn't matter. They can be fresh, they can be frozen, they can be dried, because obviously berries are expensive. So if they're in season, sure, a bit more manageable, out of season, not so much. Nuts, so they're talking about 5 or more serves per week. My little problem here is that if there's any issues with swallowing, nuts are going to be a problem. But you can then think about having nut butters, peanut butter, almond butter, depending on your sort of level of swallow, which Nicole will go into next week. So that's quite, so you're sort of eating, 1 serve, 1 serve a day, basically 5 or more serves a week. Whole grains, so I've got some suggestions for you there, and they're really good for your fibre intake anyway. Your fatty fish, so this research looked at just a minimum of 1 fatty fish per week. So you could have more, but 1 will start to get you some benefits. Looking at the lentils or beans, 3 or more per week. So your black beans, kidney beans, and look, they're quite easy to throw into a soup, into a casserole, part of a salad, just adding those in there. Poultry, so your chicken or your turkey twice a week, and really looking at olive oil as your main cooking source, and extra virgin olive oil. It used to be that we would shy away from olive oil for things like frying or high temperature cooking, but now researchers looked into it's fine to use as a dressing, it's fine to use in cooking. And wine. So they're saying 1 standard drink, no more. If you don't already drink, I wouldn't be adding this in, but if you do have a drink, it's 1 standard drink a day. My problem with this is what they classify as 1 standard drink is 100 mils, and there is no way that people are pouring a 100 ml glass of wine at home. So their stipulations here were there was no cheating and there's no catching up on the weekend, as in I didn't drink all week, therefore I'm going to drink 7 glasses in one night. So the foods to limit, this is kind of sad, but this is what the research is looking at. We're looking to limit butter and marge, cheese. They're saying less than 1 serve a week, red meat, fried or fast food, and pastries and sweets. And the main thing here that is sort of throughout all of those is saturated fat. So we're trying to minimize saturated fat. So that's where your fried foods are coming in. A lot of red meat contains a fair bit of saturated fat. If you're cooking, lean, small cuts of red meat, I would have no problem with that. The cheese is probably a bit of a deal breaker as well, but because we know that also bone health is important as well. So there may be some questions about milk and Parkinson's, but for me, we've got to be careful of our calcium intake and vitamin D for bone health. But that's what their research is looking at. Okay, so I finished off at a bit of a complex point there, but don't be overwhelmed by the big picture of research. Whatever parts of nutrition you feel that you can implement in your life, whether that is, am I having enough water? Could I look at the fibre? Should I be eating a little bit more regularly throughout the day? If there's simple things that you can start with, start there. If you're already doing much of that with diet, then maybe you can look at implementing some of the other strategies, particularly of that MIND diet, which is what I'm really impressed with, something that's quite doable in your diet. And support yourself as you go, along this with a multidisciplinary team. So occupational therapists, psychology, you could have exercise physiologist help you with movement, physiotherapy specifically around pelvic floor if constipation is a problem, speech pathology, which is what we'll cover next week, but also for all you carers out there, you've got a tough role, or an important role, and it's important that you look after yourself too. And more importantly, stay social and stay connected. I loved hearing you, chat to each other and having that connection with each other. So I think that's really important. Okay, so I guess we'll open up to question time now.